Thank you again, Olga and Kayla, for bringing this group together. And thank you all for your time and attention today. Really appreciate it. As Olga introduced, I'm Karl Blumenthal. I'm a Senior Web Archivist for the Internet Archive, where I manage the service called Arch. I call it Arch, but it wouldn't be an Internet Archive service if there weren't some disagreement about how to pronounce it. That's the Archive's research compute hub. We can agree on that. And Arch, in a nutshell, is this engine of ours to structure data sets from Web Archive collections so they're ready for kind of research curation and other creative applications. And some of you have seen it at the IIPC annual Web Archiving Conference in the past, or you've used it with your own collections. To others, I'm sure this is brand new. So I just want to take a brief tour to contextualize the service and then just make as much space as possible for my co-panelists to talk in much more detail about what they are actually able to find and share from Web Archive collections. So historically, Web Archives have posed these significant barriers to researchers who want to use them computationally at scale for these kind of main reasons. I think it's fair to say, even at the Internet Archive, we found often enough that just like provisioning the data to a scholar, that can be, even if they have very clearly articulated needs or goals for their research, it can be a project in and of itself because of the just sheer vastness or the complexity or specificity of the form of Web Archives. So even when successful, this tended to burden the end user with the responsibilities to host and compute more than their hardware might support, to develop some maybe ad hoc methods for just interpreting these big unwieldy data sets, and to sacrifice in the process some reproducibility that they could have with a community of practice that shares in methodology and with questions and ideas for each other. So with Arch, what we're aiming to do is address these historical limitations by providing a straightforward, hopefully user-friendly if we're successful, but a workflow that anyone can use to derive machine actionable data sets from Web Archive collections effectively with the push of a button, as we'll see in a moment. But beyond that, we want to support making these data sets useful as much as we can right out of the box. So with things like some basic data visualization techniques in the app, Jupyter notebooks to get started from the command line, and tutorials with the popular desktop or web-based digital humanities or data science tools that researchers already use. And our repo is open, of course. There's an API, a CLI, and a Docker image for anyone who wants to try it locally. It runs on Scala and Archive Spark. Of course, again, in many cases, it's the hardware and the maintenance from here on our side at the Internet Archive that really makes the tooling accessible. So we host Arch in a browser too. And we license that on the same kind of cost recovery model that things like Archiveit or the digital preservation repository service Vault run on. So it's in full production today, and you'll see what it looks like up close in just a moment if you haven't before. But out of the box, it currently supports collections from Archiveit. So those are our web archiving partners' domain-specific or thematic collections. And actually now collections in any format that one of you may upload to archive.org. It supports text and file extraction, some network graphing from the web, and more image-to-text, speech-to-text, and NER, named entity recognition features for all types of collections. So that's a web graph, for instance, produced by Arch in the top left screenshot on the slide here, for instance, and I can show you that one up a little closer in a moment. And then there's the workflows that we've incorporated so far. They're all open source and documented, including instructions and tutorials I mentioned that we maintain in parallel for things like the command line NER notebook in the other screenshot. So currently underway in our development phase now, we're looking forward to pushing some image classification and description and some more non-consumptive pipelines, you can think of them, for collections data hosted elsewhere, like a private vault repository or really any collection that you maintain with an item level API endpoint. Those are some of the near-term goals. But with apologies to all who were involved for reducing it down quite this much, but this is a rough sketch of that development history that Olga also mentioned at the top, starting in 2014, when the Internet Archive released Archive Research Services, which at the time complemented archive crawl specifically with some parallel data sets that it would generate in a few formats that we do still support. WAT, the Web Archive Transformation file with all of those WARC headers, Wayne, which has the named entities, and LGA, the longitudinal graph analysis format for all of those hyperlinks. As mentioned, our colleagues Ian Milligan at Waterloo and Nick Rouet at York University really picked up the baton from there and ran with it, developing, I think, about a dozen or so additional standardized data set formats for WARC derivatives in really close consultation with research teams that used them, like Emily's, in fact, for the Archives Unleashed project. And we were fortunate to build a permanent home for that toolkit and those data sets that really do form still to this day, like the backbone of the Arch service output for web archives in particular. Following a pilot phase with, I think, some of the attendees on the call today, we released the production Arch service in 2023, and its current release is version 2.1, which just last month introduced a whole host of UX improvements based on the input of our early adopters, and those first supports for Internet Archive collections and AI-assisted jobs like we use Whisper for speech-to-text and TROCR for the text recognition. If you're what it will if you archive it before, then this might look familiar. Want to provide as seamless as possible an experience for users of both of the services, but you don't have to be an archive partner to use Arch. All you need is a collection or several, which you can see listed there on the left-hand side of the screen. And up above them, maybe it's visible to you there. I remember to point out there's always an option to kind of subset or subdivide and even combine some of the contents of these into custom collections. And then over on the right, we always have a running list of the derivative data sets that we've created with Arch, the most recent appearing at the top. This is what a typical archive collection appears like in Arch, for instance. This is not conceived really as any kind of access system for the collection, so there isn't a lot of tooling here for exploring the collection like one might do on the public side of the web. Rather, we just provide a short summary at the top of what's in the box in terms of documents and data volume and how the current collection, or how current, I suppose, it is. And then a link out, if one exists, to where you can see the public version where an end user might. But mostly this is a way to access the existing data sets that we've created from this collection or to create a new one on demand. As I mentioned, we can kind of slice and dice these collections a little bit too to get more specific. What we use there for the web archives is specifically the collection level CDX records, if you're familiar with those. So in this case, for instance, we can subdivide that original collection by cert prefix, do it by status code and MIME. So we had a use case about 2 weeks ago almost at the College Art Association in New York to extract New York City art gallery sites collected by NIARC, the New York Art Resources Consortium. And specifically in this case, those that were closed during or since the COVID-19 pandemic and found that rarely have that presence online anymore. So we're like especially unique to this data set as a primary source. We're able to run some jobs on those in particular. So whatever the source is, that menu of data set looks like this today. This is where we can choose any of our source collections at that top drop-down menu and browse among 4 main categories of data sets. The collection for those WAT or domain frequencies we can do. Network is where we can get into all sorts of source and target CSV files for graphing links. Of course, everyone's excited to use the collections as these big like text corpora. So we provide the text files and even the extracted text from web pages minus all of the markup as data sets. And under the file formats, that's where we can create data sets for all of the documents in a collection of one or another MIME type or group of them that might fit under something like audio files, video, even like PDFs, WordPress processing documents, really, whatever you need. If it has a MIME, you can do it. Whatever that flavor, the output will look something like this. So this is that art gallery web graph, a little closer this time. The time to deliver one of these data sets will vary based, of course, on the volume of the input, but everything up from like a couple of minutes in some cases to might take 1 or 2 days if it's a particularly large collection. But the result will always include a single data set file to download in either a zipped CSV or JSON format. Some technical metadata along with that to verify the file, a sample visualization when we can provide one on the fly, and links to immediately load and try that data set hosted in a Google Colab space with the provided notebook or following the steps in one of our tutorials for inspiration. So that is very generally speaking the kind of experience of Arch that a scholar might have today, or that my co-panelists had in previous releases. But I'm very eager to get into much more detail. So there's my email down at the bottom. If there's a specific point that you'd like to follow up on, though, I'm sure I can answer a lot of questions today. I should say, though, that anyone who wants to can try Arch with a fully featured but free sandbox account. Comes with some collections that were donated by our archived partners for your demonstration use. And there's also a link to our GitHub repo in case you'd like to try it at home. Much more I hope to discuss here, including under the hood, a lot more about how Arch actually works. I hope with maybe the subject of a future event to dig into with our lead engineer, Helga Holtzman, and developer, Derek Enos. I just can't overstate how great a team they've been to work with on this project. And with that, I'll turn it over. I think we're going, correct me if I'm wrong, Olga, to Emily next.
Yes.
And I will follow up with questions to answer at the end.